detailed way. Probably one of my favorite people that talks about stress and trauma is Bruce Perry. And Bruce Perry refers to toxic stress and trauma differently. So toxic stress he refers to as little t, and trauma he refers to as big T. And you'll understand why. It's not saying that toxic stress is not a serious thing. It's just saying it's differentiating between the two because they are different things. So the biggest part of this definition you need to understand is with the failure for the body to fully recover. So if you think about how your body grows and changes and repairs, just use weight training as an example. What you do in weight training is you lift weights, okay, or exercise, which is the stress cycle, okay, or stress phase, and then you feed, which is when you eat good stuff, right? And then you rest. And while you rest, your body takes the nutrients from the food that you ate and then repairs your body to be prepared for a future situation of stress or exercise. So that's really how we trick our bodies into growing, okay, or getting stronger, is by measured stress with good nutrition and good rest, which then the body slowly accommodates or changes to those different levels of stress. Now, the problem is, what if all I did was I did the heaviest bench presses I could do every day, 7 days a week, and ate Oreos? What would happen is my health would decline. My strength would decline. I would probably have injuries in my shoulders and things like that. Why? Because I'm not resting and I'm not repairing in the way that the body has to rest and repair in order to recover. So when we think about that from a stress perspective, it's when we are constantly in a state of stress and we don't get the chance to recover, that it actually becomes toxic to our body, even down to the point of understanding things like cortisol. Okay, like let me give you a quick example. In the fight or flight response, your body gets flooded with norepinephrine, adrenaline, and cortisol. And these things in a stressful situation are ideal. Why? Because they trigger your body to be in a heightened state and to be able to fight, flight, or also freeze. But what they're for is bursts of energy to deal with a potentially dangerous situation. But the problem is your body isn't designed to have repeated fight or flight cycles happening back to back to back because there's no chance to recover. The best way I can explain this is if you've ever seen the Fast and Furious movies, this is my frame of reference for cars, the Fast and Furious movies where they push the button and it's NOS, nitrous oxide. They push that button and that shoots this gas into the engine. And the reason why it makes the car go faster is because that gas burns hotter than normal gasoline, and it makes the pistons move faster, which makes the car move faster. Okay, so the way you can think about it is fight or flight is like your NOS button. But the problem is, and you've probably seen this in those movies, is you can't just keep pushing the NOS button over and over again, because what happens is it heats the engine up to the point that the engine blows up. So stress response won't make us necessarily blow up, but it can, for lack of better terms, burn up our physiology by keeping those stress hormones continually engaged in our body without that rest period. So you might think of a person's life, if you've ever had a client or a person or even yourself, where your life just feels exhausting. And what it is like the stress just keeps coming, and you can't seem to get your head above water long enough to get a good breath, and it's just exhausting. It's that kid in school who maybe they're not being abused, but they they don't know if they're staying with mom tonight or grandma tonight or dad tonight, or is mom's boyfriend going to be there because he's kind of a jerk? Am I going to have money this weekend, so when I'm with my friends I can buy some food because it's embarrassing not to have food? Or they're embarrassed because of socioeconomic status, things like that. So it's that kid's life that's exhausting, or that person's life that's exhausting. So that's what toxic stress is. Some of us might be feeling this right now in our work life, in our life, our personal life, because this pandemic just hasn't seemed to let our head up long enough to get a good deep breath. It's something to think about. Now, what is trauma, and how does trauma work? Now, this is my definition of trauma. Trauma is a very studied topic right now. It's a very popular topic in the mental health and educational fields. And so it's got lots of people studying it, which means it has lots of people arguing over what it means. So it's very likely that there's a very smart person in an Ivy League school who has a very fancy definition, and they might argue with my definition. But my definition of trauma is an extreme deviation from an expected pattern that overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. So if we know the brain's a pattern-seeking device, trauma is an extreme, now that's a key part of that course, is an extreme deviation from an expected pattern, and it overwhelms that person's ability to navigate or update their pattern in a fairly timely way. So let me give you an example that's not an easy example, but an example that doesn't have a lot of variables that makes it easier to understand. So let me say I've got a 12-year-old kid, and they've in their life their life's been pretty predictable, right? So let's imagine they're driving down the metaphoric road of life, okay? So they're driving down the road of life, and they've had a lot of experience on this road. And down this road, they've had family, and their dad's been in their life, and their dad's, they go on vacation, dad tucks them in, dad's been around their whole life. And then at 12 years old, their dad dies of cancer. So they're, now, let me make another point, though. Another thing to understand about our brains, which is unique in the animal kingdom, is the idea is not only does this kid have the life behind them or the patterns behind him that tells him, oh, well, this happened, my dad's been in my life. We as humans can also look forward at other people's lives and other people's patterns and make inferences or predictions about what our life is likely to be like. So when that kid looks out into life, or into the future or down the road, so to speak, what they see is, well, other people's dads are here when they graduate from high school, when they go to college, when they have kids, when they get married, all that kind of stuff. So they make the assumption, and which is a fair assumption based statistically speaking, that their dad's going to be in their life when they get older. But let's say at 12 years old, they lose their dad to cancer. So the way to think about that is, in that moment, as they're driving down the metaphoric road of life, they have this violent collision with this new reality. Imagine like an object or a tree, so to speak, and that collision then pushes them onto this other road, a road that's terrifying. And I'm not using that word to be dramatic. I'm using that word to be accurate. We talked about anxiety is fear of the unknown. Well, imagine the unknown that comes with losing your father at 12 years old. And imagine the extreme deviation, the violent psychological consequences of losing your father at 12 years old. And a lot of time what we're doing in treatment with someone who's experienced trauma is we're trying to help them navigate the new road, because the new road is so terrifying, because the things they know now, it changes the way they experience the world. Okay, so what that means is there a lot of times when a trauma happens, and I'm saying isolated trauma, things can happen repeatedly. You can have repeated trauma too, but what that does is it pushes a person into a cognitive fog, an emotional fog. Why? Because they don't know what to do in this environment, in this new pattern or this new context with these new rules. So that's so if I was doing treatment with this young person, you would be trying to help them develop a new working model of the world, and to try to get some sense of the ability to navigate through that world. So that's what where trauma can happen. Now, it's important, and this is one of the best things I've seen around trauma, which is what SAMHSA put out, which is understanding the 3 E's of trauma helps you to understand how it's not the event by itself that creates the experience of trauma. It's the event, which is what happens to the individual, the experience, which is the event's interaction with the person's personal variables, such as developmental stage, psychology, history, those kinds of things, and the effect, which is the impact that has on their mental and physical functioning and their future interpretation of the world. So let's use the 12-year-old example. So I want you to think about that, and I'll be somewhat philosophical for just a second. When that kid loses his father, think of it this way. When you're born as a human, there's certain deals that nature makes with you, okay? One of those deals that we expect at a basic evolutionary perspective, that we expect is that when we're born, there's going to be people there to take care of us, because babies can't live without it. So there is a physiological expectation that when you're born, there's going to be people that are going to take care of you. And we also have the expectation that those people are going to take care of us until we're capable of taking care of ourselves. So that's the deal that nature makes with us. And I would argue that at least in part, that is ingrained in our physiology, okay, in our DNA. So what happened when this kid loses his dad at 12 is nature breaks the deal, okay? Nature broke that deal. And so what does that do? It completely disassembles your expectation of what the world is. Why? Because if nature breaks one of its most essential promises, then what else should I be anxious about? What else should I be nervous about? And also think of a baby at, like, say, 6 months. And that's, a lot of folks would be like, well, that's before they can remember it. Well, it's like Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. You don't have to remember something in an episodic way. An episodic memory is, I remember that time when I went and did blank with blank at blank. Okay? Your body, your physiology, when it goes through an experience, it remembers in a physical way. So even though a 6-month-old may not be able to remember abuse or neglect, the body integrates what happens into the physiology, which is, quote unquote, a way of remembering. So if you think about that, for me, the promise is that when you're a baby, that there's going to be people in your life that are going to take care of you. Then what that tells you then, when the people don't take care of you, then it violates that most basic expectation of the world, which makes you generally anxious. So that's something to think about. Now, I didn't mean to harp on that too much, but I think it's really important that we see how trauma can impact your general assessment of the world. But it's really key. And some of the information that has come from understanding the 3 E's originally was found when they were studying post-traumatic stress, originally called soldier's heart, then shell shock, and now post-traumatic stress. And what they found, the question was, how does a group of soldiers go into a very similar experience, and only a certain number of them come out with post-traumatic stress? And what the conclusions have been drawn are, it's not just the event itself, it's the event's interaction with the person's personal variables, and then the effect that experience has on their future functioning. And there are even some really interesting research around genetic predispositions, epigenetics, which is the study of how experience unlocks genetic potential. So those are things to think about. I know if you're working in the helping professions, having a very developed understanding of trauma is, in my opinion, not just a luxury, but a requirement. So what happens is, when we have trauma, on the other side of trauma, or as trauma continues to occur, it's what I call the chaos after the storm. So I was actually on a webinar last week for the Department of Justice in Virginia around school and campus safety. And the speaker before me was a mother of a child who had two children who were in school at Sandy Hook when that school violence happened. And her first grade son actually witnessed his teacher and one of his peers being shot. And one of the things she talked about was how long it took him to get back into a full day of school. And the explanation for that is because school became a different thing after he experienced that. So what does that mean? When he saw that, before that happened, before the shooting at this school, school was a place you went to see your friends. School was a place you went to learn. School was a place where you had your teacher. But when that event happened, the model of what school was something completely different, because that experience changed the pattern or the working model of school. The same thing would go for, like, losing a parent early in life. The family is a different thing for a kid who loses a parent early in life, because family doesn't mean what it meant before, because family also means someone isn't in your life. So those are things to think about. And what happens is those experiences change the way you think. Example I've given, and I'll do it briefly just for the spirit of time, is I had a kid that when he saw me for therapy the first time, and before he even got anywhere close,